Welcome everyone to our September LPC meeting. I love that we have got a group of people who are sitting in the back. Back is always, but we'd ask everybody to grab their lunch and quickly get into place because per usual, our league staff has drafted a robust and lengthy for us. First things first, it has been an interesting week in the state of Utah. And I'm sure that it is something you have all noticed and felt. We had sad memorials, like the anniversary of 9/11, and then the unfortunate shooting on the campus of UVU that has impacted all of us, whether we were familiar with Kirk's advocacy or not. And so as I drove to our meeting, building are still at half staff because of those events. My thought that I have here in we have a lot of conversations neighbor to neighbor and face to face, and I hope that we can be that example of a place where good conversations, robust dialogue on policy issues, but with utmost respect for each other and the topics that we discuss still hold and reign, and that we can help shine some of that light back to other levels and encourage them to have the types of dialogue we do that don't ignore the hard issues, but help us get to solutions. So with that, and hopefully that you all share in that sentiment, let's dive into this really deep agenda of important policy issues. First thing is that we need to adopt the minutes. We actually have two sets of minutes to adopt. We didn't have the recording running last month in August. So we'll actually need to adopt our May 21st minutes as well as our August 25th minutes for our past LPC meeting. So if I can get a motion to adopt those minutes, I see. So for Mayor Walker and from Mayor Burton, we have a second. So all in favor of adopting our minutes, please say aye. Aye. Thank you. Do we have any voting in opposition to adopt our minutes? Seeing none, we will note that they've been unanimously adopted. I'm going to skip us to item 3, which is the special session that was going to be happening today and is not happening today. Due to the events of last week and the recent court action on redistricting, the legislature and the governor agreed not to hold the special session that they had kind of planned and advertised today, and we'll be moving that into October. Justin and I were just comparing notes on the various dates we've heard. So there's probably not a firm date, but we anticipate it'll probably be early in October that they will revisit the special session, which has a number of topics planned for that special session, in addition to the new redistricting issue that has come up. So with that, I'm going to turn us over to Molly, who is going to remind us of all of the awesome events coming up in the next few weeks involving municipal government.
And before you get too excited, we're also going to talk about homelessness. Excellent. So jumping along, a few events we wanted to flag for you. The first big one is annual October 1st and 2nd. Please sign up with your folks from your city if you haven't already. We're really excited for it. We're going to have Rick Atkinson come speak about America 250 and some history with our country. So we're excited for that. Additionally, we are going to have a webinar next week on data privacy with the indelible Jared Tingey. So much to be excited about. Beyond that, we're also really excited to launch our first in-depth conflict competence course the Wednesday after annual. We've heard from a lot of folks that this is something they're interested in. So this will be a pretty full-on day of skill building that we're pretty excited for. We'll be doing a Missing Middle Toolkit webinar on October 7th. We have our upcoming LPCs. And then a big one we're excited for, the National League of Cities City Summit is coming to Salt Lake City this year. We will have some programming to complement that. The full conference runs from November 19th through 22nd, if that's something you're interested in attending. Additionally, there are some smaller add-ons. November 21st, there's going to be a reduced rate 1-day Utah registration. So if you just want to kind of come get a feel for the conference, you can do that. We will also be having a state night that Friday that everyone is welcome to, whether you are registered for the conference or not. It's not very often that City Summit comes to Utah, once every like 20, 30 years, maybe. I'm looking at Mark Shepard and he's nodding, so I'm right. So please come. It's a huge opportunity to be able to interact with other municipalities nationwide, and especially we're hoping with it being in Utah and the Mountain West, having a good showing there as well. And then I also want to flag that since it is a municipal elections year, we will be doing our elected officials essentials training again. We will send out more information, specifically registration information, once we get a little closer to the election, but wanted to make sure everyone had these dates in their calendar. We will send these out to you, and we are also going to request a save the date from you in exchange. We would love to know when your municipality is planning on doing inauguration so that we can try to get our staff to as many of those as possible. So keep an eye out for that email. We're excited to see who comes in this next year. So without further ado, homelessness. As I'm sure many of you have seen, the Office of Homeless Services and the Utah Homeless Services Board have entered into a contractual agreement for the state to acquire land for a centralized homeless services campus in the northwest of Salt Lake, looking at approximately 1,300 beds. It is intended to complement the existing homeless resource centers, shelters, and service providers throughout the state. A few things I want to flag. This has been long awaited. We've been talking about this for a while. As a legislative policy committee, it's recommended by the Utah Homeless Services Board and will be critical in addressing public safety and increasing the edits did not make it in, increasing need across the state. We still don't know exactly what impact this is going to have on the system. There's been some discussion, but no concrete decisions yet. What we do know is that there are going to be significant legislative changes, specifically around mitigation and what both contributions and distributions look like. Again, we don't exactly know what, but this campus coming online is almost going to double the number of beds in the system statewide and will have a very sizable impact. We will be sure to keep you updated with more as we know more. And something else I really want to flag for everyone is that over the last year as well, state leaders have time and time again mentioned their desire for cities and counties to do more in this space, both from a policy perspective, but also from a funding perspective. We don't exactly know what that means. There aren't a ton of concrete or specific asks, but we will stay engaged in those conversations. And as we know more, we will make sure that you know more as well. So with that, we have a packed agenda. I will pass it on to the next folks, but thank you for your time, and we'll keep you updated.
Welcome everybody to LPC, both in person and online. Cassidy, how many are online? 134, awesome. So thank you to everybody in the room, and thank you to those online for joining us. Councilmember Bradshaw, thank you for your comments to set things up after a very tough week last week. You'll notice on the agenda that the housing and land use stuff is at the end rather than the beginning. I did not take that personally when that was proposed. So there's a lot of land use and housing stuff that we'll get to, but the key takeaway in the housing and land use stuff when we get there is we're actually going to give you homework as you leave. So we'll give you the context, give you homework as you leave, to then get feedback to us over the next week or so. So that's the teaser for the housing and land use piece and why it's at the end. Let's talk revenue. Transportation utility fee. We have a meeting, and when I say we, the league officers, Justin and I have a meeting with representatives from the House, the Senate, and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints next week. We met with this group at the end of August to talk through various paths forward on the transportation utility fee. One of the key takeaways from that meeting was a concern that some cities were using methodology around the transportation utility fee that looked like a property tax and thus legally could erode the property tax exemption for tax exempt entities. So one of the discussion points has been in a transportation utility fee bill, distinguishing between property tax factors and tough factors. And property tax is based on the fair market value of your property. And then there are other inputs that go into calculating the fair market value. But having the transportation utility fee methodology be based on trip generation and traffic counts. The discussion also included dialogue around categories of uses. And I want to just hang on this point for a moment. Most cities that currently have a TUF and the cities that are currently considering a TUF already are looking at different categories. That's what actually I think bolsters the legal argument around the fee, is different categories of users have different impacts on your transportation system. So in our conversation with those different stakeholders at the end of August, our officers did a great job of pointing out that the traffic count from a SWIG in Utah is much higher than another type of commercial use that doesn't have that type of drive-in, or a residential use has a different type of impact on the system if it's single family detached versus large multifamily. So having the different categories of use is a standard operating practice when we're doing our transportation impact fees, and having similar methodology potentially codified into whatever the new bill is. And then having the different categories of users, not, Roger's got a point here, but not to say you have to spell out every single category that you do, but that you have a baseline of categories. And this was something that was in House Bill 454 last year. Go ahead, Roger.
The bill specifically allows for classifications. It was emphasized. We chose not to put specifics in because cities had differences of how they're going to approach it.
Mhm.
So nothing in the bill prohibits this. In fact, it's encouraged.
Yep.
The issue was we didn't know how everybody's going to proceed, and we didn't want to impose that. But every classification has to meet the standard of being a reasonable fee.
Well, that's exactly right. So the question is, as part of the dialogue and negotiations, do we have a little more specificity about the categories in code? And then the third key piece here is around the appeals process. And right now, some cities that have a TUF have an appeals process. It's similar to like your impact fee appeal process. So we've had discussions about that component as well. So these are all new pieces from what has been in the transportation utility fee bill the last couple of years. We put together some language and circulated it to our transportation utility fee cities and our LPC work group on this topic last week. But if there's anybody who's listening to LPC today and said, hey, I'd like to take a look at that language, let us know today. Tomorrow is legislative interims. We will be sharing some of these concepts with the other stakeholders this week in anticipation of next week's meeting. So any questions on this topic before we keep going? Cassie, I'm looking at you, see if there are any hands online. No. Anybody in the room? Okay, again, if you're interested in seeing the language we're working on, let us know today. And thank you for the feedback. I heard back from about 10 cities over the course of the last few days, which has been really helpful as we are working on this potential language. Okay, other revenue issues. South Dakota and Wyoming this calendar year have both enacted bills around property tax that should be concerning to all of us. So the first piece there is from South Dakota that limits, it's SB 216. South Dakota limits the increase in owner-occupied assessments to 3% countywide. And then that third paragraph, the bill also sets a 3% cap on the amount taxing districts and school capital outlay budgets can increase as a result of new construction, and then goes on in details there. The main takeaway is South Dakota passed a cap on property tax so that Cameron City could not raise property tax in South Dakota more than 3% in any given year. Okay, that is the law now in South Dakota. In Wyoming, the legislature actually just cut property tax 25%. But similar to Utah, the legislature doesn't actually have property tax authority. Property tax revenue is all at the local level. So the legislature did a big tax cut that impacted local budgets. to the tune of 25%. So a few weeks ago, I met with my counterparts in South Dakota and Wyoming to get an understanding of how these came to be and the challenges that that's left local governments with. I'll also note you'll see listed here gas tax and RAP reauthorization. On the gas tax side, there's been, well, actually, before I get to gas tax, on the property tax side, the reason we bring this up is that there have been quite a few legislators that have contacted us this summer concerned about the number of entities that went through truth and taxation this year and last year. They were also concerned about the size of the increases of those communities that went through truth and taxation. Now, we would follow up with them and say, is your concern with the cities or is your concern with another entity? More often than not, the concern was with the school district. That's an important nuance here. Nevertheless, we've had quite a few legislators who have said to us, we'd like to explore some sort of cap or something that would result in a property tax decrease or at least make it harder to raise property taxes. As of this moment, we do not have a bill to present to you. I think it's, well, by show of hands, how many people in here would be concerned with a bill that would cap property tax increases or make it harder to raise property taxes? Okay, that was validated. I'm not going to ask for it online. Basically, everybody in the room who didn't have a sandwich in their hand raised their hand. I assume it's the same way online. So we were actively monitoring where the property tax conversation could go. Meanwhile, on the gas tax piece, keep in mind, cities are about 15% of an average property tax bill in Utah. On the gas tax side, there's been a lot of chatter at the Capitol about the fact that gas prices are higher in Utah than they are in surrounding states and trying to tackle those gas prices. The gas tax is now a percentage on those prices. So we pointed out, we want to make sure any conversation on gas prices also recognizes ripple effects on gas taxes, and local governments get 30% of gas taxes. Of that 30%, cities and counties, cities get about 2/3 of it, counties get about 1/3. And then on the RAP reauthorization, there are a handful of communities that have some challenges around RAP reauthorization. We've contacted those communities specifically because there's going to be discussion at interim tomorrow about these communities in particular. We're going to do a separate call for them after LPC, but it's led to a bigger conversation about the process around RAP or ZAP reauthorization. So again, no bills yet, but just rumblings in the revenue space, and there'll be a discussion on RAP tomorrow. Well, we bring this up because municipal revenue relies on property tax, relies on sales tax, relies on gas tax. And so anything that, even though we're a minority of the property tax, anything the legislature does on property tax could impact us. Anything they do on gas tax could impact us. And then there's been a lot of discussion around sales tax headroom at the state and sales tax on services at the state. And do they want to revisit those policy dilemmas again? Because the legislature is running up again against the fiscal cliff. And this is what led a few years ago to the effort in the final year of Governor Herbert's administration to expand sales tax to services. Ultimately, that failed because of the statewide referendum. That in turn led to the legislature considering Constitutional Amendment A last year. That ultimately did not get voted on because the Supreme Court ruled that the legislature didn't follow the right process to put Constitutional Amendment A on the ballot. Constitutional Amendment A would have allowed income tax to be used for other state services. Because there is no Constitutional Amendment A yet, there's still this pressure on state sales tax. So there's been a ton of dialogue this summer about all these different revenue streams. And as usual, we keep making the argument that anything you do on the state side, outside of income tax, has a ripple effect on local revenues. So again, no bills to present to you, but we just wanted to give you that overview of the different stressed revenues and revenue rumblings as of today. Any questions about these pieces? Cass, anybody online? Okay. The last thing is Paul Jerome, the Assistant City Manager in West Jordan, represents the league on the Asset and Investment Review Task Force. This task force is examining the different state laws around reserves that public entities have, how you use those reserves, how much you can have in reserves. And so this task force is chaired by the state treasurer and will be providing recommendations later this fall. So we want to make sure that this was on your radar. We've had some preliminary conversations with Paul about how that dialogue is going. And there may be a point in the not too distant future where we'll need to put together a small group where Paul can come back and say, here are the ideas that are coming up. What do we think before we bring it back to LPC? And so I just want to put that on the radar. Ken.
Notice.
Here comes the mic so people online can hear.
So the state auditor has sent out a survey related to this issue, collecting data for their reporting in the fall. But we only got notice on August 29th and it was due last Friday. So there wasn't much time to turn that around. So we're late.
And
as
did
of
that come from the
today.
treasurer's office or the state auditor?
I think the state auditor.
Okay,
It could be the treasurer. I'm not sure.
okay.
I didn't receive it, but my finance director did. My point is, they just didn't give us a lot of time.
Okay.
It's a pretty extensive data collection exercise for us.
Okay, no, that's good to know. And let's follow up afterward and get a copy of it and to know where it fits into this puzzle. So just want to give you an update there. The last piece in this revenue piece is on the beer tax. Molly, I'll turn it back to you to talk about the beer tax.
Excellent. Thank you, Cam. So we've been looped into some conversations with USAVE this year about the beer tax. So local governments receive a portion of beer tax revenues to exclusively use for funding activities related to the prevention, treatment, law enforcement, prosecution, and confinement violations related to alcohol and substance abuse. Each year, municipalities are required to report on the use of their funds. And in recent years, a pretty sizable amount of this money, about a third of it, or $3 million, cities have just not been spending, and it's just been accruing year over year over year. And the state wants to make sure that those dollars are being put to good use. And we want to make sure that those municipal dollars are being put to good use, because the state can always find a use for that money if we are not spending it. So there are a couple of proposals out there that we wanted to make you all aware of. So first is the USAVE is looking at just some administrative policy changes, making sure that they notify cities that you can defer your allocation to the county if you feel you don't have the feasibility to regularly spend this full amount, identify best practices for spending beer tax funds, provide clear examples that are not appropriate uses. But this is the big one, is that they are looking at, once you have 3 years allocation plus $50,000, your community will not receive further distributions until you spend that down. Those dollars will then be reallocated to those who aren't capped on their distributions, with the exception being if you have any sort of capital project or asset or big thing you're saving money on to buy a one-time purchase, you can submit a report to them for that. So we just wanted to flag that. We told them that we don't take positions on bills until they're numbered, but if there are any big red flags amongst this group, would love to hear it so that we can pass that along. All right, thank you.
I am certain there was a good joke about going from beer taxes to water fees, but I don't know what it is. So as many of you will remember, last month we had our DEQ water fees discussion here. Nathan Lundstad from Division of Drinking Water came and presented. Thank you to everyone who put in feedback on their form. Today is the last day to put in feedback. So if you have been sitting on that great DEQ water fee feedback, today's your day to put it in. They did their hearing last week. We put in our letter outlining and aggregating the concerns that we heard. So thank you again for everyone who sent those. The word that we received last week is that there will be some changes to this fee based on the feedback that has been given. We don't know exactly what that will look like, so we'll bring that back to you and promulgate that when we have it. But just want to let you know that one, today is the last day if you do need to put in any comments if you haven't done that yet. But then two, the comments have been effective and that there will be changes. I don't know if that's good news or bad news yet until we see what those fees are, but there will be some changes there. Moving over to air quality. So there have been a lot of pieces of legislation it's that time of year we're starting to see a lot of proposals come out there, a lot of ideas floated. And so the next several bills are going to be around proposals that are out there. We want to get your feedback around whether these are things that we care about, whether things we want to deal with, whether these are just things we want to try to push aside. So first one is a clean truck amendments bill. And so background on this one, research from the Division of Air Quality found that heavy-duty vehicles built before 2010 are one of the biggest sources of air pollution on the Wasatch Front. So in essence, what this bill would do is require the owners of those vehicles, so those big heavy-duty vehicles from before 2010, to contribute to a clean air fund to offset their pollution impact, while offering those owners a tax credit to upgrade to less polluting vehicles. So why do we care? We might not. Which vehicles does it apply to? And this is directly out of the proposed legislation. So high emission heavy duty vehicles, meaning a motor vehicle that has a gross vehicle weight rating of more than 14,000 pounds and a model year of 2009 or older. High emission heavy duty vehicle does not include a farm tractor, a farm truck, or an implement of husbandry. Where does it apply? Basically non-attainment areas. So Davis, Salt Lake, Utah, Weber counties is where this applies right now. What is the fee? $250 for the application for renewal in a major non-attainment county, or $45 if the application for renewal is not in a major non-attainment county. So basically Wasatch Front is going to be $250, other places $45. Who is exempt? And this is the part where we just may not care. A farm truck or farm tractor, which we show the definition of, and a motor vehicle that is exempt from a registration fee under 41-1A-1209. 41-1A-1209 covers political subdivisions of the state and municipal corporations. So from the way we're reading this, the registrations for your vehicles as municipalities shouldn't change at all under this. That should be exempt. We think we're reading that correctly. That's a question we asked Ledge Research. So we don't think we actually care about this bill too much. The money goes to the Environmental Mitigation Response Fund that would be created in the bill. So putting it out there, one, to let you know, this looks like something that we might care about. Because of the exception, we probably don't actually care too much about it. But if anyone would like to see the draft, I give input or double check that we're reading this correctly, feel free to email me and I can send you the draft of this. It's technically protected, so we can't send it to everybody. But if you ask me for it, I will send it to you anyway and get your feedback. So that's where that one is at. Any questions or comments on this one? All right, quiet crowd today. Because Jared always drives questions. So we're going to implemented a decision really quickly that I know many of you are aware of. Have Jared present that, and then I'll come make some comments on where this could be going.
Thanks, Justin. Just wanted to make you aware of this case if you haven't already been made aware. This is a case recently ruled upon by the Supreme Court. And the facts are that Armenta called 911. The EMT showed up saying that that he was fine. He said that he had shortness of breath and chest pain. And they said, well, everything looks fine and you probably don't need to go to the hospital. 1 week later, he was taken to the emergency room and said that basically he needed a heart transplant because one of his heart arteries was completely clogged. He sued United Fire Authority and saying that the EMT misdiagnosed and therefore caused a shortness of his life, if not immediate death or soon early death. And so UFA said, well, we've got governmental immunity when it comes to emergency medical services. And the district court ruled, dismiss the case, and it went to the Supreme Court. And after reading the opinion, this was my face. This is how I felt. And it didn't make sense to me. So the question that they had to decide was whether or not the Governmental Immunity Act protected emergency medical technicians from suit for providing emergency medical assistance. And the Supreme Court said, well, actually, emergency medical assistance doesn't actually mean that. it actually means that when there's a catastrophic event, meaning that if there's an emergency, of like fighting fires or other instances like that, that's really what it meant, is when cities are providing emergency medical assistance in those specific instances, not on a regular basis providing medical assistance to residents of the city. So they looked at the code and said, well, you've actually got to look within the code to see what it means, what emergency medical services mean. To me, it's pretty clear what it means, but apparently to them, it was not clear, and they came back with a completely different definition. What this does is it takes away our governmental immunity as it relates to providing emergency medical services. So this is a big erosion of our governmental immunity. And it's something that we plan on looking at this legislative session to see what we can do to address this. And so that's the summary, and any questions? It is. So yes, we do expect, well, the question is whether or not there's going to be any legislation around this. There are multiple groups that are concerned about this, obviously including our own group. But we've heard concerns out of the chiefs, out of public employees, out of the trust whose building we're in right now. There's multiple groups that are concerned about this. We want to try to get in front of that and see if we can coordinate efforts around it, so we don't have a lot of different angles coming at this one, a lot of different proposals. And so what we're looking for is anyone that would like to volunteer to be a part of a work group, who would be interested in that. We've already had a few people say yes to that. But if you're interested in working on this issue with us and proposing and trying to find some proposals that could alleviate some of our concerns from this ruling, reach out to me, jlee@ulct.utah.gov. If you don't have my email, but reach out to one of us so we can get you on that work group as we move forward with this issue. So Jared, thanks for presenting on that one. All right, let's talk about elections. And let me tell you, these are exciting proposals. So if you've been asleep, I want you to wake up, because these are fun. Now, to give a little background on this one, these are proposals where individuals or legislators in some cases have reached out and said, hey, what do you think about this? And I said, well, I'll tell you what I think about this, but I will also go and ask our legislative policy committee what they think about it. I'm not trying to change how you think, but here we go. Elections. The question that we're going to be asking here is, how do you feel about primary elections being optional for municipalities? So there is precedence in the code for this. A special service district, or special districts as we're calling them, under 17B13066 says a primary election may be held, does not require that a primary election be held if authorized by the board and there are two or more than two candidates per open seat. So some election officials reached out to me and said, do you think municipalities would be interested in having municipal primaries be a may, not a shall? Their reasoning behind this is, it came a little bit from ranked choice voting experience, where they said those cities that have done ranked choice voting save a whole lot of money by not having to do a primary. Whatever you think about ranked choice voting, that part is true. You are saving a whole election worth of funds. And with vote by mail, you plan for a 100% turnout election, whether you get it or not, because you mail a ballot to everybody. So there's a cost there. So we're going to do a Slido on this one. Carson, do I just go next slide, or you take? All right. So we have a Slido question. So please pull out your phones, scan that QR code, or go to slido.com. number 3563004. And would love to get your input on this one. If anyone has questions, we can definitely have discussion or thoughts on this one. And there's not a specific piece of legislation. Again, these are some election officials that asked the question. But the question is, how do you feel about primary elections being optional for municipalities if there are not more than two candidates per open seat like special districts? Well, and right now, so actually, Carson, I should have clarified this question. Before you answer this, let me clarify this question.
I didn't clarify it well enough when we were typing this up. So how do you feel about municipal primary elections being awful for municipalities? Full stop. That's the question. Right now, it is optional. You don't have to have a primary if you don't have more than 2 people per seat. This is just saying you could have no primary election regardless of how many people are running. So what is your comfort level of having a option to have or not to have a primary election, regardless of the number of people who are running? Sorry, I should have clarified that. So that's what the proposal is. Special districts right now are not required to have a primary regardless of how many people are running. The question is that something you would be comfortable or not for municipalities? If anyone has any comments, feel free to make them or just leave them in Slido. All right, I'm going to leave this open for just another second. And we say for the record, we used to get really excited when we get over 100 responses on a Slido, and now that's our norm. So thank you all for the feedback. We know we ask you a lot of questions, but we really do go back and analyze all of it, and it really does help us a lot. But we're going to move on to the next one. The next question is around local school board elections. So the question was asked, what if local school board elections were moved from the general election year to the municipal election year or the odd numbered election year? So instead of having just municipal elections on the ballot, they would also have local school board elections on the ballot during the municipal election year. The pushback that I gave right out of the gate on that one was we're not subsidizing any cost for that. If that were to happen, they would have to pay for their own elections. Any additional costs would have to come out. We're not subsidizing it by any way, shape, or form. And that's a big one. And if we don't have a primary, they have to pay for their own primary. That's just what it looks like. So cost-wise, that was some of the pushback. But on those questions, yeah, how do you feel about local school board positions also being elected during odd numbered years? A couple things to consider on this one. Ballots would need to be coordinated. If the county is already running your election, coordination of ballots is not a big deal. If you're running your own election as a municipality, there are a few of you still doing that, then you would have to coordinate getting those on there. Yeah, question in the back from Kate.
Does this mean they're going to move those elections back to being nonpartisan, or are we going to have partisan and nonpartisan together if they do this?
There was no discussion about that piece. The potential sponsor has said, because a lot of them are nonpartisan, he would look at that. But he was just asking about what if we moved him over. So going to the Slido question, how do you feel about local school board positions being elected during an odd number year? What's your comfort level with this one? And again, these are proposals that were brought to us, and I said, yep, we'll ask everybody. I'm not asking you to get excited about these by any means. I'm gonna give it, yeah, Norm.
Indicate what problem they're trying to solve.
The sponsor, he just said he thinks the local school board election. So the question is, what problem the sponsor trying to solve? Then that's always a great question. He indicated basically the local school board elections just get buried at the bottom of the ballot in a general election year with everything else going on. He doesn't think they get the spotlight that they should when they're buried in that ballot. So this would just be bringing them on a ballot with fewer races and therefore having more debate over those candidates. Yeah, Lynn.
Yes, does this mean that they want to move judicial retention elections to the municipal ballot as well? Because those get lost too.
Yeah, those do get lost too. There was no discussion about that. I'm going to editorialize for a second. For anyone who doesn't know, I was in the state elections office for several years. Yeah, I mean, if I had my way, we'd move all kinds of things around for better visibility on that. We'd have like a local year and a state and federal year, and they'd be two separate things. But I know a lot of people don't like that idea. But yeah, if I was going to move things around for visibility, I'd move a lot of things around. But that's not what the sponsor was looking at. Editorial over. All right, moving on. Let's move on to a completely different topic, utilities. And just so you know, Cam, we are still way within time to spend way too much time on housing and land use. So Even though we bumped it to the end, we still got there. All right, so utility, so a proposal, this is another one that was brought to us. One, we've heard about this from actually at least one council member. And then a legislative research reached out to me about this one as well. But utility markings. The question was basically asked is, should utility markings be done with paint that will wash off in 6 months or less? So I have a couple questions. One is, I do not have a Slido on this one, nor did I bring spray paint that you could write it anywhere. But is this a problem? Do you see this as a problem where utility markings are just there in perpetuity? So Mayor Burton, yes, it's a problem.
Yeah, the problem, like you can make that all the time. And people who do utility marking, they're only good for 2 weeks anyway.
Right. So
if the paint lasts 2 weeks, you have to renew it, then they should renew it, and if it lasts longer than that, that is a problem, and it's a book together.
So yeah, so for those online, so Mayor Burton says, yes, one, utility markings are only good for 2 weeks. So having them there in perpetuity doesn't really work that way, and you do get complaints about that. So yeah, Mayor Walker, Alexa's running the mic up. You love utility markings? Mayor Burton would like utility markings to be a year long. Or Mayor Walker, excuse me. Almost threw that off. Is that part of your campaign this year? More utility markings. Love it. Any other questions? Is this a problem anywhere else? Is this something you're hearing about from residents? Yeah. West Jordan residents don't like it. If you have issues, if you want to go check with any of your utility folks and find out this problem, reach out to me. Let me know if there's a problem. There may or may not be legislation around this. I guess if we had legislation that said utility markings have to wash off with paint 6 months or less, I don't think we would have a problem with that. I also don't know if this is one we spend a lot of capital on or not. But just asking the question. So with that, we're going to move over to short-term rentals. So turn the time over to Carson.
All right, thank you, Justin. And I've been asked to refresh the PowerPoint while I'm up here.
Far out.
All right, so short-term rentals. Let's see. Oh, no. Got a lot of slides to flip through here. I'll just start talking while I'm doing fast-paced clicking. So we've received a new proposed bill draft on short-term rentals, and there's really 3 provisions in it. Now I'll explain a little bit of context here, but we wanted to just get some high-level feedback. If we think it's necessary, we'll reconvene the short-term rental working group to dive in a little bit more, but there's really 3 mechanisms here. First is the bill would prohibit local governments from imposing fines on short-term rental listing sites like Airbnb, VRBO, et cetera, and say that you can only impose fines and penalties on the owners and operators. So you impose fines on the property owners, not the listing sites. I am not aware of any local governments in Utah who are imposing fines on listing sites. Please let me know if you are. The second piece is that it would state that short-term rental listing sites are not required to share data with a local government. So you couldn't require Airbnb to share everybody who's rented a property, et cetera. And then finally, it allows local governments to require a listing site to provide the number of nights a rental is occupied. So a little bit of context here. The first 2 provisions, in our reading, this is largely consistent with most of the United States case law on short-term rentals. There are 2 major provisions. First, the Communications and Decency Act, and then there's also some privacy concerns. Most courts are generally finding that short-term rental listing sites are protected from regulation, from local regulation, because of the Communications and Decency Act. However, just last week after LPC, there was the New Orleans case that I mentioned. New Orleans has adopted a maybe one of the most robust ordinances regulating short-term rentals in the country. And that ordinance actually requires listing sites to not only share data but to also verify that short-term rentals listed within the city boundaries are compliant, have a permit, et cetera. Airbnb sued, and then just 8 days ago, the district court there actually found in favor of New Orleans, which is sort of inconsistent with a lot of the other case law we've seen. Airbnb is planning to appeal, so we'll sort of see what happens there. But again, our read of this is most of this bill is generally, while it is restrictive on local governments, it's generally consistent with case law. The other thing I wanted to mention is that third piece is, I think, an extension of what we can do already. Right now, House Bill 256, which passed last year, said that local governments can request non-binding site delisting. So if you go to a listing site and say, these are illegally operated, they are out of zoning, or they're not complying with zoning, they don't have the licensing requirements, et cetera. You can't require them to, again, based on some of the previous case law, but you could request it, and then that's where 256 ends. So right now you could try to make the argument that you have the authority to require a listing site to tell you how often things are being occupied. But I don't think any of the listing sites probably would feel like they would honor that based on state law right now. So not speaking for them, but that's just my guess. So we're not asking you for a proposal today. We sent some red lines back on this bill with technical feedback, and we will wait till we have an actual bill in front of you. But I just wanted to sort of give you a heads up on this new legislation. Right now, we're not anticipating this to be a major fight, but every single short-term rental bill that we've had at the league for me has been a major fight. So we will keep you posted. I have the kind of 3 key provisions here. If you have feedback on these, if your city is interested in trying to impose fines on short-term rental listing sites or does, please just let me know, and we will aggregate that feedback and convene a working group if we need to. Any questions? Awesome. Move on to everybody's favorite part, which is surveys. And this is survey season, not to be confused with Slido season, which is year round. We've got 2 surveys in the field right now, and then we're actively working on another one, which Cameron will talk about a little bit more here in a minute. The housing and land use survey, we're extending the deadline to this Friday, the 19th. We've already had a lot of cities fill that out. It was distributed through the City Managers Association, and huge thank you to all the city managers, administrators, and planners who've prioritized getting that filled out. We've already had quite a few responses, so that's excellent. But we had quite a few cities also asking for more time. Some of the questions are kind of complicated, particularly in high growth areas. So we're extending it. If you need additional time on top of that, or if you have questions, please reach out to me. Happy to work through that. The second one I wanted to mention is the Utah City Engineers Association survey. This is on public improvement standards. There's been a lot of questions. We've had probably 5 or 6 years now of disputes over public improvement standards at the Land Use Task Force. There's been some bills. That was the genesis of things like road width. This year, we are trying to get some actual hard data. So we put together, in partnership with the city engineers, a really complicated survey that most of you do not have to fill out or worry about. Your engineers are working on it, but I just wanted to give you a heads up if you saw something about that. We are working in partnership with them on that one. And then the last survey Cam briefly mentioned, we have a couple of handouts here in the room, and we'll be distributing it online. And then in the follow-up email, we will be asking you some more in-depth questions on the MIHP 2.0 strategies, rather than try to do that on Slido, which has a lot of information, and we don't want to try to ask you to prioritize 20 things on your phone. We're just going to send that in a follow-up survey as well. So keep an eye out for that, and we think that's probably the best way to get feedback. Are there any questions on research before we jump into the really exciting housing and land use stuff? Awesome. Well, again, my email is keilers@ulct.utah.gov. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you have questions on any of those. And then Cam, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, before we jump into housing land use, are there any questions or bits of feedback on anything else we've hit in the agenda? Because once we start the deep dive here, we'll be rolling up our sleeves for a bit. So is there anything that has come to mind from anything that's come up thus far? Can't see anybody online. How many are we up to online now? 144. That's awesome. That's awesome. Great. Okay. For the next few weeks, Molly started LPC by talking through what's on the agenda. We've got the annual convention in a couple of weeks. Hopefully everybody here is registered. Even if you're retiring from office, we hope you join us so we can celebrate your service. Those of you who are continuing, we wanted to meet with you during the convention, and there'll be 2 new toolkits that we'll talk about briefly at the convention, and then we're going to do some webinars about them later in the fall. Both were funded through the Land Use Training Fund at the Office of the Property Rights Ombudsman. The league has been involved in both of them, and they were spearheaded by Wasatch Front Regional Council and the Mountain Land Associations of Governments. One toolkit is focused on missing middle. So you'll recall a couple of years ago at the annual convention that we had the national expert Dan Paralek on missing middle come present. One of the key takeaways we heard from you in the survey results from that conference was that it was an interesting presentation, but there were a lot of questions on the how to do it. And so the toolkit is an effort to try to get to the how. Likewise, on the center toolkit, we have used center data this whole summer within the state housing plan to show how all of our communities are planning for centers. In fact, we have seen a massive increase in the number of centers that our cities have planned for just in the last couple of years. Well, one of the questions that also has come up is we've had a lot of particularly newer elected officials who've asked us, who've asked WFRC, who've asked MAG, what is a center? How do I know it if I have one? What goes into the planning of the center? And the effort here with this toolkit is there are now 30 different centers that are part of this toolkit. So you can look at different types of centers and say, okay, which type of center would actually make sense in my community? So there's some really higher intensity urban centers that would be more like a downtown Salt Lake City style center. And then you have centers that are going to be more focused on transit in the suburb centers, and then you'll have other centers that are more medium density mixed use centers that don't have transit, and then a variety of concepts therein. So the intent here is to try to help visualize what do these different centers look like. Now, we've been successful during the course of this legislative interim, pushing back on arguments to preempt local land use authority around transit stops and transportation corridors, in large part because we've been able to demonstrate this data of how cities are planning for centers. So one of the terms that we've used regularly in the state housing plan world over the last few months on how to turbocharge those centers. Let me take a moment and just remind us where we started and where we are. So the state housing plan got underway in earnest last year, paused during the session. So it set the principles during last fall, paused during the session, picked up in the spring. And at one point this spring, there were over 160 potential policy tactics. There were multiple work groups. And again, thanks to the league, mayors, council members, and staff that were involved in these different work groups. There was a technical committee focused on data collection. And one of the key principles in the state housing plan has been collaboration over preemption. When I look at the categories of state leaders right now, so this is broader than state housing plan, but just legislators and other state leaders, there are some that legitimately want to partner with cities. And I'd say that number is growing. There are some that want to preempt local land use authority like we've seen in other states. I have conversations weekly with legislators in that category. And then there's a sizable number of legislators that just aren't sure. I think there's some issue fatigue as part of that. And then there's others who just keep asking us what will actually make a difference when it comes to affordability, and then what are good planning principles to help us prepare for the future. So those are the 3 general categories. So where we are now, the state housing plan has to report to the Commission on Housing Affordability and the legislature this fall. We've invited the governor's office to come present at the annual convention in a couple of weeks. In fact, we have broken up our caucus discussions based on large part of feedback from board members. And instead of having all the caucuses happening at the same time, they're going to be staggered through the conference footprint. And then we will have the governor's office attending several of those caucuses along with league board members and staff to discuss what the state housing plan means for different types of communities. So that'll happen during the annual convention. The Commission on Housing Affordability met last week and got a quick preview of what's to come in the housing plan. Nothing is finalized in the housing plan, but the plan is to have a public draft of the housing plan available this fall for public comment. and then have a final draft ready by the end of the calendar year. The Commission on Housing Affordability met last week, and thanks again to Springville Mayor Matt Packard and South Jordan Councilmember Don Shelton, who represent the league on that commission. And the commission will next meet on October 30th, so it's possible there'll be a deeper dive at that CHA meeting. Before I get into today's objectives on the next pieces here, Councilmember Shelton, is there anything you'd like to share with the group about the Commission on Housing Affordability, either last week or just the experience thus far this interim?
Sure. Thanks, Cam. I have to say, in the past, I haven't understood what the makeup of the Commission on Housing Affordability is. And, there's legislators there, there's finance people there represented, and there's people from developers and land use, the land use group. And I think it's great to have all those interests represented at the table and discussing things in a relatively rational way. Last meeting, there were proposals put out. One, and I also have to say, I really appreciate Cam texting me during the discussion so that I understand more about what's going on. And also Ryan Luce, our city attorney. It's very helpful for me to have a deeper perspective so I can represent us well. But last meeting, Senator Fillmore talked about a bill, and Chris Gramvoulis from the land use group, was fully supporting it, and the bill would preempt a city's ability to control developments in infill projects. And we talked about that, and I felt like the bill, or I said that the bill would probably be a good idea in a moderate income housing plan 2 as an option for cities to so that we can choose whether we're going to do that kind of thing or not. But if it's a preemption, then we would be standing against that bill. We also had the Home Builders Association come and provide us with a bunch of anecdotal information about how bad cities are treating them in terms of plan reviews and inspections and building permits and the costs, and arguing that private engineers should be able to do those kind of things instead of cities. And thanks to Cam and the league and staff for providing information that allowed me to bring into question the reality of what the Home Builders Association was saying. I have to say, I grew up, my father was a builder, home builder. I grew up in the home building world. While I went to college, I worked with him as a home builder, and I know that there is tension and frustrations between home builders and cities. And, I know my dad always hoped that certain inspectors would not come, but we were able to refute their arguments with the legislative audit that looked. And so, the people working with people, there's going to be challenges, but widespread systemic challenges, the legislative audit pretty much debunked that. And then we had a great conversation afterwards, I think, and I just appreciated the staff support to help me represent you well. So thanks.
Perfect. Thank you, Council Member. And again, Mayor Matt Packard from Springville also represents us, and he spoke up and pushed back on some of the assertions that came up in that meeting. And then Councilmember Shelton indicated that we had a really feisty but productive conversation afterward with several of the stakeholders. So where we are now is we are anticipating the state housing plan to identify their prioritized tactics for their public draft in the next few weeks. And I applaud the governor's office, Steve Waldrop, Laura Hanson, their whole team has done a really terrific job of putting all the stakeholders together, listening to feedback and figuring out paths forward here. So what I'm about to show you is not the state housing plan final draft. What I'm going to share with you is what they presented to the CHA last week, okay? So, I get actually one slide before that. There were 160 some odd tactics. They narrowed it down to 40 some odd tactics and then asked everybody on the different work groups to submit what we thought the most important ones were. We want to be transparent back with you. These are the submissions that we sent back in as our highest and best, highest and top priorities. Funding the state infrastructure bank. That's where MIHP 2.0 is going to come into in a moment. Technical assistance to growing communities. I'm going to rest on this one here for a second, because I see several people in this room, like Jan from Hideout and Mark from Saratoga and others who've been involved in our work group with what we've referred to as edge communities. And these are communities that are relatively small today, but where growth is banging down the door. And it's easier to say no, it's harder to say yes, and it's harder to say yes because of infrastructure challenges and a lack of expertise. So when we talk about technical assistance, we've had a work group that's met a few times this summer, and one of the key takeaways for us has been that they also need additional appliers. It's not just they need someone with technical assistance who writes the plan. And a lot of these edge communities also need someone who can help them actually administer and apply it. So we've had some conversations with consultants in the planning and engineering space, with the chamber, with the cities themselves, the governor's office, counties, AOGs, trying to figure out a path forward on what's been identified as tactic number 4. The use of publicly owned land for affordable home ownership. This was something we talked about quite a bit last year, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it today, but this was one that we highlighted. The rural Main Street and housing. This is trying to do centers in rural Utah and housing where there's infrastructure already in the most historic Main Street areas. Study to estimate the limits to growth in housing from water supply constraints. The cheering in the back of my mind I can hear is like the voice that study that's been looking at infrastructure capacity and then engaging the public in growth and planning conversations. We also, again, leaned into turbocharging identified Wasatch Choice centers and investing in the Legacy City program, which passed last year for the first time to try to help older cities with older housing stock convert those older units from rental units. So those were what we submitted based on all the Slido feedback and board direction through the years. This is what Steve Waldrop presented. But we're on the list they presented to the CHA. I expect this list will still change over the next few weeks, but this is what they present CHA for purposes of discussion. The last two that are bolded are we're going to talk about now, and they're not surprises. We talked about them at the last LPC and we're reporting back to you, but state direction around detached ADUs. And then this is word for word what the tactic says from last week, but I expect this tactic also may change in its wording, but incentivize local governments to implement zoning reform by leveraging existing state funding programs. This is also where MIHP 2.0 comes into play. So let's start first with detached ADUs. Those of you in the room should have picked up one of these in the back. Lynn, your hand is up. So Alexa will bring you the mic in a second. Those of you online, you'll have a copy of it on the screen. And let me make it clear up front, we are not asking for you to vote on this today. We are giving it to you today, and I'll explain the next steps in a moment. Go ahead, Lynn.
Yeah, just a quick question before we get into ADUs. On the state housing plan, and maybe this question is premature, but do we anticipate that the next steps in the legislature this year in the legislature will be incentives, carrots, sticks, mandates, or some of all, or are we waiting to see?
Okay, so Lynn, I'm going to go back to this bottom piece here, because I think it's really important to emphasize that the governor's office and their team that's been working on the state housing plan has in the document, the draft document right now, the principle of collaboration over preemption, okay? Then if you were to take the governor's team, the legislature, and other state leaders in this space, they fall into these three categories. Some want to partner with cities, and that's the MIHP 2.0 piece. So to use your terminology, it would be the carrots piece of, but I've actually told them, I really don't like this language of incentivize or carrots. To me, it's really the spirit of partnership. So, you work for Sandy City. If Sandy City is doing certain things and the state says, we want to see more of these things, we're going to partner with you on infrastructure funding to support what Sandy is doing. To me, that's not an incentive, that is a partnership, right? That's what that category one is. And I'd say, and Councilmember Shelton was part of these discussions at the CHA last week, this is generally where Representative Cal Roberts, who is the Commission on Housing Affordability co-chair, generally speaking, that's where he's at, is in that category one. Category two, some leaders want to preempt local land use authority. That runs the spectrum. There are some state leaders who have told us flat out and that they think we should take more of the California, Texas, Florida style approach, where the state just steps in and says, cities, thou shalt do it this way, and remove land use authority. So those voices are still very much there. And then I think there's a good section of people that are in this to be determined, like they're not sure where they're at. And it's critical that you're talking to your legislators and reporting back to us about where your legislators are at on this spectrum. And we've been leaning heavily into that partnership over preemption mantra, because that's the core principle that the board's adopted. Does that help? Okay, great. Got a thumbs up. Okay. Any other questions, big picture, before we jump into DADUs, as we've been calling them internally? Okay. Anybody online, Cassidy? Great. Okay. Can the folks online see the DADU sheet or not? Nope, no, okay. I'll just walk through the framing here. Should detached ADUs be allowed in some form statewide? This is the exact slide we presented to you last month. There's appetite to do something in this space at the Capitol. Most MIHP cities currently allow them in some form or fashion, so a minority of cities don't. So there is a political capital question here. And the board told us in June and reaffirmed it in August to look for a proposal to allow detached ADUs so long as there was local flexibility on the details, on the implementation side. So 3 weeks ago, we presented to you what we called A, C, and D. And A and C were more in the preemption space, but are based on actual bills being drafted currently. And then D was state requirement to have an ordinance, but local flexibility on implementation specifics. When we surveyed you as LPC last month, you can see that first bar is what you told us. So 66% of you were in the somewhat comfortable, very comfortable space. And then we open it up for comments. You gave us a ton of great feedback that we've tried to incorporate into this document. We presented this document to our LPC advisory group last week. And you can see the numbers actually went up a little higher from that advisory group. And we have tweaked the document since then based on feedback from the advisory group. So what you have, for those of you who picked it up on the way in, and it'll be available for those of you online later, is a document that outlines potential draft language around detached ADUs. And really the core of it is that cities above a certain size would be required to have a detached ADU ordinance. So think of it this way: you're required to have a general plan. There are certain things you're required to do. You would be required to have a detached ADU ordinance. But then the actual implementation details would be left to local governments, but there would be certain things that you would have to consider. So for example, in the language, it says you shall have the ordinance. The city shall allow it on lots larger than 10,000 square feet, but subject to infrastructure capacity and other zoning requirements. At least one unit has to be owner occupied unless the city proactively says no. And then it kind of walks through what the ordinance shall consider, but it doesn't say what the specifics are. It's just you have to consider this. Again, we're not asking for a vote today. The league board asked us to put together several paths forward. This is the path forward we're bringing back to you for consideration. We will send a follow-up email after LPC today and give you a week to take this back to City Hall and look at it. We have not presented this to the state housing plan folks. We have not presented this to legislators or stakeholders. This is still basically an internal document where we're trying to figure out is how can we address this path forward, knowing there are going to be other bills in this space? Is this a reasonable alternative for us? Yes or no? And we'll ask for your feedback over the course of the next week, because the league board will next meet on September 30th. And we want to go back to the league board on September 30th and say, here's what we've heard from the membership about this path forward. It's viable and here's why. It's not viable and here's why. And then we can go back to the state housing plan, Commission on Housing Affordability and others and say, here's our alternative compared to the other alternatives that are out there. Okay, with that being said, are there any questions about this document while we're all here? Recognizing we're not voting on this today, it's for your consideration. Let's go to Dwayne over there.
Well, what do we envision when we say subject to infrastructure capacity? I expect the builders are going to look to us and say, what does that mean?
Sure. Sure. So for those online who maybe can't see it, the language that you'll be considering over the next week says the city shall, subject to infrastructure capacity, allow it. And then down below that's in subsection 3 and subsection 11, letter G talks about sufficient system and project infrastructure access and capacity. And to answer Dwayne's question, as the advisory group has gone through various detached ADU concepts, top 3 in every conversation has been the sufficiency of infrastructure. And what became clear as we were having those advisory group discussions was there was no easy way to define that. It's one size fits all to define that in statute. Obviously, you have to have sufficient infrastructure for housing of any kind to work, right? So it doesn't matter if there's a proposal coming before your city that's 1,000 units to the acre or 2 units to the acre, you need sufficient infrastructure to make it work. So the idea here was keep that decision at the local level, require it to be a consideration, don't spell it out in statute. I do anticipate, and I think this is where you're going, that other folks would look at this and say, well, this is just a reason to say no, because the city will say they have insufficient infrastructure. But I would come back to the fact that most cities right now allow detached ADUs and have figured out how to make it work for infrastructure. In some cities, it's citywide. In other cities, they've said it'll work here, but not here because of infrastructure constraints. And so that's the model we were trying to get at here. Norm?
So Cam, as I've requested or suggested before, we need to make sure that we're kept whole on this. Right now, this is one of our strategies to continue to add these to our different zones. And that takes away 3 or 4 years worth of 5 years worth of future compliance with MIHP.
Sure.
If this becomes mandated. So somehow that needs to be given us credit for those things.
And that's a perfect segue to 2.0 because detached ADUs will be on our 2.0 doc. It's a great point, Norm. Mayor?
Cam, did I hear you? I thought I heard you say this does not only applies to large cities.
So right now it's defined as an MIHP city. So cities above 5,000.
Okay.
Yeah. But again, this is why we're putting this out here for people to chew on, recognizing there will be other bills in the detached ADU space. So we'll say no to those other bills because all those other bills have a pretty deep preemption as part of them. Is this a reasonable alternative to those? And then as part of the 2.0 conversation. Any other contextual questions before we pivot to 2.0? Let's go back to Dwayne. Cassidy, anybody online? No, okay.
Is this law intended to supersede things like current HOA regulations that would prohibit detached ADUs?
Yeah, great question. So that was another piece that came out in the advisory group is there was a lot of concern about the state interfering with existing development agreements. And the language you have in front of you here would say that the state requirement would not supersede those development agreements. Now, HOAs are related, but slightly different. With internal ADUs a few years ago, the state did say they were preempting those contracts as they were preempting city ordinances. Our language has been silent on HOA pieces, though I anticipate that'll be part of the conversation. We were mainly focused on like, what do you do in your ordinance? And what we were again trying to avoid here is a preemption that says thou shalt do it this way, and instead say, okay, city has to have an ordinance, but we're leaving these details up to local government because one size misfits all, and it's not going to work the same way in every neighborhood everywhere. Okay. So again, timing wise, the league board meets on September 30th. You'll get a follow-up email today with a link to this document as well as 2.0. I'm going to segue to 2.0 here in a second. And you'll have the email will tell you when to get feedback back to us so we can aggregate it, analyze it, take it back to the league board on September 30th. And then we'll have the conference on October 1st and 2nd, where we'll be talking about the housing plan in the caucuses. So lots of discussion to be had in the next couple of weeks. Cassidy, you're holding the mic, so that makes me think there's a question.
There is a question. Marcus Alton from Hyde Park asked, can we allow deed restrictions for the DADUs?
Great question, Marcus. Thank you for bringing that up. So the language we've put up here is silent. It has the ownership piece in it, but was silent about the affordability component. So I'm just double checking here. Yeah, so Marcus, I'm glad you brought that up because that came up in advisory and just didn't make it onto this document. So I'm adding it right now about that the city could consider the affordability component. Perfect. Great. Thank you, Marcus. Any other thoughts on this one? Okay. Norm mentioned a moment ago about being made whole. Let me explain what he means. MIHP 1.0 is on the other document that was in the back of the room. Thank you to Cassidy for putting this document together. What you'll see in gray is the current MIHP. And this was part of the discussion at the Commission on Housing Affordability last week. The current MIHP has about 30 menu items. Several are weighted more than others. That was actually a recommendation that came back from LPC last year, is that some should be weighted more than others if they are a higher value tactic. And the status quo is tied to eligibility for the transportation utility or transportation investment fund. Here are some of the key takeaways that we've heard loud and clear from the members this summer. To focus on the league board principles is first and foremost. But then if we're making changes to MIHP 2.0, objective compliance criteria, only based on what cities actually control, give credit for the good things that cities are doing. So in Norm's point about giving credit, if a city's been doing a tactic for a period of time, it's been a good tactic. You don't want to lose credit for doing that tactic. Better data collection to understand both what cities are doing and how the private sector is responding, because it's not just about cities, and more user-friendly data collection. So those have been the objectives with which we've been viewing MIHP 2.0. The discussion at CHA last week, both during the meeting and after, was around this particular state housing plan tactic. And there is an expectation that with 2.0, and this, Lynn, gets to your question about sticks and carrots, is that not every city is going to do 2.0. Right now, every city has done 1.0. And the feedback we've been getting from state leaders is we want to focus on the actions that we feel like are making a good difference when it comes to planning and when it comes to the actual city legislative action. And HTRZs comes up and stationary plans come up as a perfect case study of where you can see the city did these things, and then here are the planning outcomes. And the city's both planned and in some cases has put the zoning into place for these outcomes. Now, what's important to emphasize about those is most HTRZs and stationary plans don't have new development happening right now, because that's really outside of our control. What is in our control is, have you done the plan? Have you put the zoning in place? Whether or not the private sector is building right now is outside of our control. We shouldn't be punished for those things. That's out of our control. So the idea is not every city is going to do 2.0, but the state will partner with the cities that do. So it's not a punishment that they're withholding money, but they're going to partner with the cities that are taking these meaningful land use actions. And there are two ways that could look like. One is extra credit for state dollars. The other is eligibility for new state dollars. Okay. At the advisory group last week, we asked a couple of questions. Well, the first question is from last week. The second question is from the previous meeting. How do you feel about 2.0 incorporating scoring for extra credit for state funding? So this would not be applicable to like our local revenues. So our 1%, the gas tax revenues we receive. And this was quite interesting to us. 76% of the advisory group said they were somewhat or very comfortable with that approach. And then we had asked in the previous meeting, how comfortable are you about the MHP 2.0 framework as eligibility for new infrastructure money? And you can see 67% were in the comfortable space. So building off of that advisory subgroup data, before we open up the next slide of question, let me explain what you have in front of you, because like DADUs, we are not asking for a vote today on this document. This is an effort to try to pull together everything we've heard. Then you can take it back to City Hall, digest it, and get feedback to us that we in turn can take back to the league board on September 30th. So the second side of this document, Moderate Income Housing Plan 2.0, tries to highlight the different zoning actions that has come up in the different conversations all summer. And we're breaking them down into three categories. There's the center category, there's the housing variety category, and project approval category. In the center category, you'll see some that are tied to transit. So I mentioned HTRZs and station area plans, but several people on the advisory committee call last week pointed out, and it's an excellent point, that if you're a city that doesn't have transit, you don't want to be ineligible for additional dollars because you don't have transit, and therefore you can't do a stationary plan or an HTRZ. Excellent point. So the centers category is broad enough to encompass all of the different Wasatch Choice centers, of which there are over 300 that cities have identified. And the majority of those centers are actually not tied to a track stop or a front runner stop. Second category is housing variety. And a lot of these concepts are things we've heard from our cities. So, you know, Heber City is doing an overlay right now for a portion of Heber City to allow additional housing types in those zones. We have some cities that are looking at what's known as that mansion style multiplex. We have several cities who told us they're looking at doing or have already done density bonuses in exchange for affordable home ownership. Taylorsville City, Mayor Overson, your team presented to the advisory group last week about Taylor Villas, which the city just approved, which was basically a density bonus in exchange for ownership with some affordability. Correct? Am I stating that correctly? Great. So this is an effort to try to capture, like, what are the things we're already doing now that are just not being captured in the MIHP 1.0 reports, to show like we are doing our part to plan for growth and have that captured with more specificity in 2.0. This third category is a little bit trickier because this gets to project approval, and you can't determine what projects come before the city. But if you have a project that is seeking the House Bill 572 dollars from the state, and they come to Cameron City and seek approval, and you approve it, you should get credit for approving that House Bill 572 funded project, because one of the requirements for House Bill 572 is ownership and affordability. So that was kind of the catch on the project approval space. This is also where deeply affordable housing comes in, because Molly mentioned changes with the campus model, and there's a lot of discussion about what can and can't cities do with land use to facilitate deeply affordable housing. Well, at the end of the day, from a land use perspective, there's only so much you can do, because if you zone for multifamily, for example, you're subject to what the market's going to bring. But if the market brings a transitional housing project and you approve it, you should get some sort of credit for approving that sort of project. That's the concept we're trying to outline here. Now, how many points each of them is worth is still up for discussion. We got great feedback from the advisory group, and that'll actually be part of the follow-up email that we'll send later today with this, is we want you to prioritize these. We want you to tell us which of these do you think are the highest priority, medium priority, lowest priority, because that'll help us as we try to build out 2.0. And 2.0, again, is tied to funding the state infrastructure bank or those other state resources to help local governments with infrastructure. Okay, I've thrown a lot at you. We do have a couple of Slido questions for you in a moment. What questions do folks have here about what's on the paper, recognizing you're going to have a week to digest this? Let's go Norm up front, and Cassie, let me know if anybody jumps in online.
Yeah, just some clarification. You
Yeah.
said some cities will do MIHP 2.0, some won't. Is the intention to have both of them in place?
Yeah, that's an excellent question too. I think right now that question is up in the air. So when Councilmember Shelton, Carson and I met with Representative Roberts and Senator Fillmore last week, that was one of their questions is, does 2.0 replace 1.0? Do you still have 1.0 to give credit for what folks are doing? And we told them, like, we haven't gotten to those conversations yet because we've still been talking about how these tactics fit in the umbrella of the state housing plan. The reason I say some cities would likely qualify and some don't is because I think there's an appetite at the Capitol to partner with cities that in their minds are going above and beyond. And there'll be finite resources for that. So they want to partner with the above and beyond cities, kind of a race to the top type concept. It is still an unanswered question about like, what does this mean for MIHP 1.0, which gets to your point earlier, of like if cities are doing things over here that don't make it onto 2.0, then it feels like you're in no man's land. So other questions? Mayor Burton asks when we get to 3.0. He's grinning. I'm not sure I can laugh at that yet because there's been a lot of discussion and dialogue the last few months, but it's been ultimately, I think the main takeaway here is there's an appetite at the Capitol to partner with cities. And we don't want to lose that moment because for several years there, that was not the appetite. The appetite was just to pound cities to do certain things. And now it feels like there's been this shift, like we want to partner with you and we want to partner with you on meaningful actions that cities have taken. So help us know what those are. So Mayor Burton, I don't know what 3.0 looks like, but it feels like there's a moment here for us to craft a 2.0 that makes sense. And Lynn?
Yeah, I don't have the answer to Mayor Burton's question either. Let's hope that's years away. But I don't think it is surprising that the state wants to focus on what's actually happening rather than just plans, amorphous plans for some time in the future. One of the things I would want to highlight with our partners at the state is to remind them that we can authorize, but with rare exceptions, we don't build.
Yeah.
So I want to make sure we get credit for what we have authorized, regardless of what does or does not actually get built.
Yep. Amen. Amen. And that gets back to one of those core objectives of cities only control certain things. We don't control those market forces. And again, HTRZ, I think, is just a really good example. Stationary plan is a really good example, even though they're transit focused. Like Eric and Vineyard, how many units are you guys contemplating in the Utah City HTRZ? Okay, 12,000 units is what you're contemplating in the city. How many of those have been built as of September 15th at 1:32 p.m.? I know I'm putting you on the spot, but you can be approximately right. Yeah, about 600 out of 12,000, right? So we don't want a scenario where Vineyard, Sandy, whoever is criticized because you've entitled and planned for and zoned for all these units that the market's just not producing or is planning to produce over a decade period of time. And I think there are legislators who've finally internalized that message. And again, Cal Roberts is a former city council member, so he gets that perspective. And that's why he's helping trying to steer the conversation toward this partnership model, which I appreciate. Okay, so we do have a couple of quick Slido questions and then we'll finish with preliminary plats. So this is an unanswered question. We ran out of time at the advisory group, so we just wanted to ask it broadly here. But different sizes of cities have different capabilities. So a city of the first class of over 100,000 residents has much larger footprint than a city of 10,000, but they're both MIHP cities. So one thing we've talked about is, unlike now where everybody has to do 3 or 5, regardless of the size of your city, do you have more of a sliding scale? So bigger cities are required to get more points than a smaller city, but everybody's still required to do something, okay? So we wanted just your first blush thoughts on the sliding scale approach based on size of city. Again, first blush here, this will be helpful as we report back to the board in a couple of weeks. So I'll leave this open for a moment. Then I've got one more slide of question and then it's to you for the last item, right? Okay. So I'll leave this open for 30 more seconds. I should also note, I had made a note of it here. When you get your follow-up email later today, We want to know what tactics on this 2.0 list are missing and should be there. So Clearfield, for example, like Mayor Shepherd, how many times have you and I chatted about the no lot lines that you guys approved? You did everything the builder asked for, and then the builder came back and said, never mind, we can't actually hit a price point that we told you we could, right? So this Clearfield City should get credit for that. You can't control how the market ultimately responds. So if you have specific examples that are not in the 2.0 list, we want to hear those as we build this out and kind of merge it with the conversations happening in the state housing plan about how the pieces fit together. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question here. And then how do you feel about just this overall concept? And Lynn framed it perfectly of prioritizing local legislative action, ordinances, zoning, et cetera, over the current MIHP, which is aspirational, non-binding planning. And to just put this in context, Carson has read all of the MIHP reports in the last couple of years, thousands of pages. Thank you, Carson, for going through it. There are some cities that have picked a menu item and said, we aspire to do this, but basically every year the report is we're thinking about it, right? Yep, we're studying it, we're thinking about it. And then you have other cities who have said, not only did we plan it, but here's what the action we've taken, the zoning action we've taken, that's put it in place. And so Lynn said it makes sense. The legislature wants more of an emphasis on what cities are actually doing and then give credit where credit is due.
And I just want to clarify, I think the reports suggest that most cities are taking actions after reporting and studying. Obviously, these take time, but I do think the reports tell a positive story of local governments overall. Another piece of this is just being able to better track what is actually working, which is a question I hear from cities all the time. And I would say that due to the text-heavy nature of these reports, it's really hard to be able to say these strategies or these policy approaches are working better than others. So that'd be another point to emphasize here is not only by focusing on the actual legislative changes, you could see the policy outcomes, and that could be a helpful tool for local governments as they're thinking through their own communities.
Perfect. Thank you, Carson. I'm going to turn it over to Jared. I'll just wrap with this. Thank you for the feedback, both now and over the course of the next week. The league board will meet on September 30th. So your feedback will help inform those board discussions. And as soon as we have the draft of the state housing plan, we'll circulate it so that you're prepared for the conversations at the annual convention on October 1st and 2nd. But a lot of moving parts between now and then. So thank you for your feedback. Jared, I'll turn it to you and go Utes this weekend. Thanks.
Let's see.
Yep.
Okay. This is one thing that we've already brought up before, but we wanted to flesh out a few more details and receive your feedback. This is on land use application expirations. And currently the state law says the continuing validity of an approval of a land use application is conditioned upon the applicant proceeding after approval to implement the approval with reasonable diligence. The state code does not define what reasonable diligence is, and many cities do not have those definitions of what reasonable diligence means. And before I jump into actually what the alleged problem is, there is a question legally on whether expirations of applications are that we can even have those. Because right now it's valid pending the developer proceeding forward with reasonable diligence. Now, if they're not proceeding forward with reasonable diligence, that's different. But automatic expiration dates, that will be and is being challenged in various meetings that we've been in. So just be aware of that. So the alleged problem that they are trying to solve is that there's these expiration dates, and while there are some things that the developers are doing, that they still are not getting their things approved later on down the road. because they're waiting on outside entities to approve certain permits and other things that are out of their control. The other problem is that many municipal codes don't include what they have to do to be reasonably diligent in pursuing that application. And so they have felt like, well, we're trying to move forward with this. And even though we're trying to move forward with it, you're saying that this expiration automatically it expires and we have to start over again. And so as we have asked, what they would like and what they've recommended is putting into state code what it means to be reasonably diligent. As we've asked our housing advisory group how they would feel about a state statute that would define that across the board, 73% were comfortable, 14% were concerned. Now, that was based off of an example of Mill Creek City's ordinance. And they have defined, they've said Mill Creek City will grant an extension of the validity of the land use application if there's good cause. And then they've defined good cause as justifiable and reasonable reasons why an application did not commence in a timely manner. And then they've got examples of what good cause looks like. And some of those are changes in site conditions, lack of materials, financing issues. We have brought up in these meetings that the reason that it's a problem for us of stagnant applications is that our land use laws change between the time that the application is filed and 5-10 years down the road when nothing's been done. And we shouldn't be able to be held to those if circumstances have changed. They've acknowledged that. I think that, and they've acknowledged that we don't want to protect bad actors on either side. So that is the challenge that we're trying to solve, and seeing if this is a resolution or a reasonable path forward for defining what reasonable diligence means. So we've got a Slido question here for you. How do you feel about including a definition for reasonable diligence in state code based off of the Mill Creek ordinance? So this is just an example. Now, Carson, can I go back, or do I need to be on this screen? Because I kind of want to. Okay. Okay. So yeah, just to reiterate, Mill Creek's ordinance basically says we can extend your expiration date based on good cause. Good cause is giving justifiable reasons and reasonable reasons why they're not pursuing anything further, and then it gives examples of what justifiable reasons may be. Norm.
So one concern that I have with that was talking about financing. Just as an example, the condos right now, that's a financing problem. That's a market condition, not our condition. I mean, theoretically, they could continue to have continuation after continuation after continuation of an application because of market forces that we and they have no control over.
It's one of those conditions. Financing conditions is a non-starter for you. Okay. The crux of the question is, can we get to a place where there are conditions where we have in state code that we can agree upon, even though they're difficult for them to meet, but that there is a standard that is in state code that defines reasonable diligence? That's really what we're getting at with this question. Is there a path forward based upon different items that we can put? Now, Mill Creek's ordinance is just one of, just by way of example. So that's the crux of what we're trying to get at is there a path forward or is there not? If we make those, if we define what those are, then are we okay with having a state standard? Like I said, as the housing advisory group that we ran this by, 73% felt comfortable, and 14% were concerned, if I remember right.
Mark Saratoga. Hey, I think the question would get a different answer if it wasn't based on Mill Creek's ordinance. I think because I'm not as familiar with it as I perhaps should be, because that should be the standard for everyone. But
Come on, Mark.
but fundamentally, you keep asking me if I'm good with that, and I'm like, well, I don't know how their ordinance is written. You've given a summary, that's great. But if you change the question to just be some procedural process, I think you'd get a lot higher answer as opposed to, I'm not sure how that ordinance necessarily works in our world. I mean, we've got an ordinance. If it was the Saratoga ordinance, we're all in. But I'm just saying how you're phrasing the question is causing a little bit of maybe some hesitation on our parts on how to respond. So thank you very much. It was not meant to be a criticism of Mill Creek. Bless you for all you're doing.
So what you're telling me though, is that there is a path forward so long as Saratoga Springs has, priority rights. Okay. I just wanted to make sure I understood. Okay. Thank you. We're gonna close this down, wrap this up, and turn it over to Molly.
Thanks. We wanted to give one last update on the local administrative advisor program. We're working with the governor's team as well as Senator Owens to ensure that the program is fully funded moving forward. If you are from an LAA community, we will be reaching out to you to ask to sign on to a letter of support. This is a huge piece in the technical assistance that we were speaking about with bringing more housing and development and assisting communities statewide, and having this program being fully functioning is critical for that. So we're really looking forward to this. Thanks.
I really thought Molly's update would take a few more minutes. So we've reached the end of our agenda. Thank you all for participating and taking the time to be here, and for everyone that was online. I did enjoy being on the chat for a bit there. So we are down to our final motion, everyone's favorite motion. Can I get one of those? I think that was Mark. Yep, Mark made the motion to adjourn. We have a second from Dan Dugan. All in favor of adjourning, please say aye. All right, sounds like it's unanimous. See you all next at the annual meeting.